Hello and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. It's 3 p.m. in the UK and it's 10 a.m. Eastern. You're all most welcome to join us here at 0 Days Live. I hope you all had a very pleasant and healthy weekend. Today is, of course, Monday, the first day of the working week for most, and that means it's Industry Insights Day. Now, today we're going to be talking all things finance. Finance services, or financial services rather, is a highly regulated industry. Firms need to prove compliance and due diligence in its processes, part of which will form part of cybersecurity. And we'll be talking a bit more about that in a while. We're lucky enough to be joined today by Alphus Hinds, who runs a cybersecurity consultancy in the financial services industry, and we'll meet him in a moment. Also coming up this week, with today's discussion around the specific cyber challenges facing the finance sector, we also have tomorrow's special show around the coronavirus-related threats that we're seeing here at Nominet, as well as looking at the value of frameworks for building an investment case for cyber. We're also inviting back one of our special guests from last week, Gary Foote, Chief Information Officer of HAS F1, who will talk to us about managing pressure in the cyber world. So please do stay tuned for another packed week here at 0 Days Live. A quick introduction from me. My name's Stuart Reed. I'm with Nominet, focused on cyber solutions. And given the very dynamic nature and the even more dynamic situation we face right now, we thought we'd try something different. A little bit about us. You may be familiar with Nominet, being responsible for managing the .uk domain. We've been doing that for over 23 years now and have something in the order of 15 million domains under management. In addition to that, and building on our experience of domains and DNS, or the domain name system, we also provide cybersecurity solutions to protect both government and enterprise networks worldwide from cyber attacks, including providing service to the UK government's National Cybersecurity Centre. And at Nominet, ensuring people are able to be connected, included and secure is at the heart of what we do. And with a lot of people perhaps feeling slightly disconnected from one another right now, especially with all the usual conferences, events and face-to-face meetings being paused at the moment, we thought it'd be a great opportunity to do something a little bit different and create a webcast that is open for all within or with an interest in cybersecurity. The premise of our show is really simple: to provide an opportunity to hear from others in the industry, get a roundup of what's going on in the news, and share some thoughts on best practice as we all navigate our way through what is and continues to be a changing world. But most importantly, we want your involvement too. During today's show and throughout any of the other live shows that you join, you'll notice on your screen there is a console with the ability to ask a question or provide a comment, so please do use it. Any questions that you have, please ask us and we'll read them out during today's webcast. Also, just a quick reminder that we're keeping this all very authentic. And as you can see, we're running these webcasts every day live between now and June. And because we are live, anything could and probably will happen at some stage. But we do hope you agree that if and when that does happen, it's just part of the charm and nature of the show. Now, in line with our previous shows, we're running for about 30 minutes a day, but there are no hard and fast rules, especially not today. So if you are not able to join us for whatever reason live, or indeed join us for the whole entirety of the show, then please do catch us on demand. You can find all of the shows listed at nominetcyber.com/0dayslive, which is the same page that you signed up from originally, so it really couldn't be easier. As with every show, we are joined by a great team, both joining me here in the virtual studio and also behind the scenes, plus some very special guests joining us each day. Now, let me introduce the team. Firstly, Steve. Morning, Steve, or afternoon, Steve. How are you doing today?
Good afternoon, good morning. I'm good, thanks. You, Stuart?
Good stuff. I'm doing very well, thanks. I don't know whether I should call you Steve or whether I should call you the Terminator after last week's phone-in show. I see you've lost the sunglasses today, though.
I have, yeah. I mean, it's still a little bit sunny outside, but it was getting a bit dark inside, so I've lost the sunglasses.
Very wise. So first things first, Steve. Brand new week. Last week, I did ask you about your pet peeves. This week, I'm going to pause that for a while because I want to ask another burning question. I want to know, how do you take your tea?
So it's got to be builder's tea, white, no sugar, preferably in my Liverpool mug. I've got no other requirements other than that.
Excellent, very solid choice. I would imagine it's a popular one with everyone listening as well. And on that subject, everyone that is tuning in today, please do let us know how you're taking your tea. And if it's not tea, whatever else is you're drinking, please do let us know, or any other question or comment that you have. Please do use that console as I mentioned before, and Kerry will read them all out on screen. And speaking of Kerry, how are you today?
I'm really good, Stuart, thank you.
Excellent. And again, burning question of the day, how are you taking your tea?
Well, first of all, I want to comment on Steve's mug. I mean, a Liverpool mug. Really? Not cool. But I am taking my tea today. It is very minty. Ooh, get it in the shot. Very minty and very Moroccan. It's very tasty.
Excellent. Well, I like to see the effort you put into that as well, Kerry. I'm very impressed with that, has to be said. And the teapot is pretty special.
How are you taking yours, Stuart?
My tea today, I am taking black with just a slice of lemon.
You guys are really fancy compared to me. You do realise that you do not set any expectations this week. This is going to be my tea all week, right?
Well, we'll see. We'll challenge you that tomorrow. So everyone, please do join in tomorrow just to see if Steve's going to vary up his tea intake. We shall see in due course. But that aside, let's move on to today's discussion. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we were lucky enough to be joined in the studio today by Alphus Hinds. Morning, Alphus, or afternoon, Alphus. How are you doing?
Good morning, and good afternoon as well.
Indeed, depending on where people are joining us. Now we can, there you are, we can see you.
I'm
Excellent.
right here.
Well, so my first very important question was going to be how you take your tea, but actually my precursor to that is, what's that I can see behind you?
Judge Dredd, I am the law. I mean, the Dredd character for me is iconic of magazines, but also where we are. And, you know, and it's been a constant in my life for a long time. It was a gift from my brother. He revamped a lot of the comics for film, and we watched through the Dredd evolve over periods of time. He's a cyborg, really.
Excellent. I'm glad I asked the question. That's almost more of an interesting question than how do you take your tea, but I do feel compelled to ask that question as well. So, how do you take your tea?
My good cup here. In fact, I enjoy a nice bit of ginger, fresh ginger, turmeric, and some rosemary. And then from a tea bag perspective, womankind tea.
Wow, excellent. Well, again, Steve, you've got a lot to live up to tomorrow, I think. So you're going to have to vary it for the benefit of us and the audience, I believe.
And please, no Liverpool mugs are here.
I am completely blown out of the water. I should have prepared much better for this. I thought something a little bit more imaginative than my builder's tea.
You've got almost 24 hours to prepare an idea for us, so we'll look forward to hearing that tomorrow. So Alphus, you know, getting back to the subject today, clearly financial services is both a regulated industry, but also a highly significant one, more generally speaking as well. So for the benefit of our audience, first, before we get into the questions of kind of your role within helping financial service organizations, just give us a little bit of background about you, your role within cyber, and how you found your way there.
Okay, many years ago, because I'm an old man now, I actually started with British Rail. And at the time, I had an apprenticeship that they gave me, and it was to do with computers, because there was no formal computing apprenticeship or scholarship. So they sent me off to Newcastle. And that's how I started getting involved in computing. I actually came out of what is called the Department of Mechanical and Electrical Engineers, but they had a computer department, and you know, it was in the old days where you started building your own, and they were the first guys, actually in the UK, many people don't realize this, to put in a high-speed data ring between 3 mainframes and drop off 120 local area networks, which was outstanding for what was called a Luddite institution, slow, cumbersome British Rail. But when I graduated, I went into research, the department there, and I had an area which was called kind of vision thinking that they put me in. And its main task at that time was focused around safety. And the flip side of safety was security. And sadly, it was during the period where the IRA had a lot of intensity and focus towards rail infrastructure, blowing things up. So that's how I really got drafted in. It was trying to use neural networks in terms of driverless trains, but also in terms of some of the safety projects that British Rail were bringing to bear. And akin to that, we worked very closely with the military. So that was kind of my first foray into the cyber, but it was, and I prefer to call it integrated security. It's an anomaly that we have cyber because you don't talk about serrated knife crime, you just talk about knife crime. And at the end of the day, we're talking about information security, and the precursor to that is physical. And then for a convoluted path, I spent time in the States with NASA, looking at self-configuring computers and mission-critical systems. Again, the twin sides of that is a security component, even though we're calling it public safety. And there may be lessons that we can revert back to in terms of calling, cybersecurity more aligned with public safety, seeing that it's ubiquitous and it affects all of us. It's consumed at the public level. It's not just B2B anymore, very much so. And then I spent time back with mainly in major events, which was preparing Beijing for their Olympic Games, Athens for their Olympic Games, Atlanta doing the reviews for that, which covered the spectrum of physical as well as cyber and operational security. My foray into the financial sector actually came via the fintech. And I know you've introduced it as a very regulated industry. It is, but increasingly it's not. And why use that? If you take the fintech area, that's actually not regulated to the same extent as the traditional banks, if at all. So, if you look at the financial industry, there's a broad church underneath that, from your insurers to your fintechs to your traditional banks. And each one of them have their own unique profile, even though we use the aggregate financial industry overall. Because, if you take Microsoft or Tesco's as a bank, Tesco's, its prime industry is to sell retail, but it's amassed a number of money, it's opened up a bank in a similar context. And how we think of money has changed as well. It's digital money, it's not real. I can't go to the Bank of England or Barclays and get my promissory note, which is written on the back of your pound coin. I promise to pay X amount of gold. So we virtualized it. The currency that we trade in today is data, information.
Okay,
that is really the lifeblood of the industry.
And I guess that actually bleeds into my next question, because there are some perhaps unique characteristics of the finance sector. And I think you touched on a few there in terms of how it's becoming wider, and the inference is that with the onset of digital transformation, it's becoming much wider, and cybersecurity is becoming far more important in terms of playing a role there. But what makes security particularly difficult in the financial services sector, in your opinion?
Legacy. A lot of the banks have been around for a number of years, and they've put in monolith systems, and they've been written and centralized. So we're in an age of decentralization and moving much closer to the consumer. We're app enabled at the end of the day. So that's one of the key challenges, understanding your estate. Because there's a lot out there to marshal, to be able to monitor. And I think we've all met the challenge of parallel systems being developed at the same time in terms of your shadow IT. The other key thing is actually rewriting code. We should and we must have the focus around what we call in the development, security, operations cycle, the DevSecOps. That's a big challenge because you've got a lot of legacy code that needs to be updated. So it's speed of acquisition in terms of moving thought and culture. So one of the big challenges is actually changing the culture towards security. If it doesn't break, why fix it? And a lot of people are very scared to venture into updating or revamping their systems because it will cause a lot of pain.
So there seems to be, from what you're describing, a bit of a collide between kind of established techniques, legacy systems, as you say, and perhaps the kind of the intersection or interspersing of new technology or new digitized techniques. So, with that in mind, what would you say is the biggest concern right now for the financial service sector in terms of cybersecurity?
Okay, if we take this from a risk perspective as well, what are the key risks of the financial sector? It's actually adaptation to new technology. Banks, traditional banks, have to become less bank and more fintech. And then you've got the fintech side that move at a breakneck speed. Their prime mission and remit in life is the adoption and pushing out product. So you get the product side pushing out new product, and to a certain extent, security is the adjunct to that. If we go back in time, remember Volvo, when it used to run a number of advertisements in Saab, and they spoke about safety. They actually sold their product based on safety. In a similar context, increasingly the push from a consumer-led perspective is about bank safe security now. So one of the key challenges that banks really have to face is twin. One is talent. There's a skill shortage, but there's not a talent. So it's the adaptation of what you have and the expertise you have. And the other one is understanding what to focus on it. It's being data-centric. What do I protect? Protect less, but protect deeper, because you cannot protect everything, and you shouldn't even try to. The other is a dispersed, a fragmentation, really, of the IT infrastructure, and push more out to the edge. It's not centralized anymore, and it's managing that and having consistency of controls across your estate. This is one of the key things that we're grappling with.
And I guess also kind of the underlying thing that you're saying there is around reputation as well, because we talk a lot about brands having potentially damaged reputations if they are not handling cybersecurity or indeed having a security breach at all. I guess from a financial perspective, reputations are also a really important part of the consideration for financial institutions from a cyber perspective too.
Absolutely, the reputation is key. Interesting, when you do look at the breaches, what you are finding, there's an initial dip in the share price, but it does recover. The public is very forgiving in terms of utility, financial markets less so. The other real key aspect is viewing data. Yes, it's your lifeblood, it's your competitive advantage, but it's one of your greatest liabilities from a regulatory compliance point of view. We've all been focused around GDPR, but there's GDPR spin-offs in a lot of territories that we work in, from China to New York, to Dubai, to Brazil. Each one now has its own data protection, and as part of that, there's a fusing between hitherto legislative data privacy and the controls which you need to implement through cybersecurity. So it's actually one of your big risks is the fine from the regulator. Because, if you're talking about 4% of global turnover, it's quite an impact at the end of the day. So it's actually becoming far more articulate in understanding the dynamic and fluidity of risk that is represented in the cyber domain. It's not static overall, but it's the convergence of technology and adoption of it. And how does this actually sponsor and drive the business? Because if you take the fintechs, they're akin to our children. They're digital native. The banks, from a legacy perspective, are digital adopters. So they're playing catch up in that area.
And I think what we're seeing is there's no shortage of cyber attacks that are hitting kind of the mainstream press right now as well. So I think that's starting to kind of make people more aware of some of the potential impacts that are taking place as well. Now, Steve, I see that you've popped up online, which can only mean one thing. You're itching to ask a question. So what is it?
I am. So I was just going to ask who you think the biggest adversaries are taking action against financial institutions. Is it nation state actors, cyber criminals, or I know sometimes those two types of adversary blend into one. What type of adversary are you seeing in the financial sector?
Financial sector is criminal led. Fraud is fraud at the end of the day, theft is theft. What we have seen is the lowering of the boundary to enter. So the benchmark to enter has got lowered, and then the whole ability to affect a large number of people. So if the barrier's been lowered, and also the velocity at the rate that you can affect a huge number of people. A lot of the crime is automated crime, and then you get tailored crime, such as business email compromise, whereby, you know, I'm having an email conversation, it's trusted with you, and then, you know, someone's been monitoring, and then it's diverted over to a rogue server. They continue that communication, and I pay out money in a trusted environment that I believe I'm speaking to overall. You get a lot of probing, hacks coming through as well, and predominantly still it's through your email. You know, people clicking on links, opening attachments. You get targeted, and it's an interesting point because criminality is used as an extension of political goals and nation state. And then, you know, you've got states, and we've seen a lot of attacks come out of Russia, for example, and they say, you know, there's particular syndicate groups, you name them, but, you know, it's not news to anyone that some of these are state sponsored as well. And we've all used, you know, sub-state actors. Some of the criminality that takes place are conduits for other activity, conduits for maybe funding terrorists or politically motivated violence as well. There's a rise of hacktivism, but predominantly around the financial sector, the honeypot has been money, but increasingly it's information, because of the value stored in terms of the profile, the digital footprint. Your digital profile is a commodity that can be traded on. I may not want to attack the bank. My value may be stored in the fact that I can actually on-sell your credentials, on-sell your profile to a third party.
That's interesting. So it's not just the actual money aspect of the financial sector, it's the data as well, which I think that's quite a big shift from years of bank robberies and things like that. It's not just shifting that into the cyber world, is it? There's a whole new aspect of it now as well.
It is, because, you know, you've got to see banks as a information repository. Anytime that you log on, log off, it's profiling, and they will act in concert with other tools as well. Because, you know, I need then to act on the fly and rapidly develop new products, and these are becoming specifically tailored to your needs. So what I've got on you is a complete history, and that history becomes valuable in various aspects of your life that I can tap into.
That's interesting. So the attack,
point of view.
Yeah. So the attacks are clearly shifting in a different way, and there's different risks. So how do you think the approach to cybersecurity needs to change for those financial institutions? Because I think you said earlier, clearly you cannot continue to try and defend everything. So how does that mindset need to change?
One is understanding the data that you have, what is valuable, your crown jewels. The other key thing is recognizing why try and defend a perimeter when there is no perimeter to defend. We've hitherto spoken very much about zero-day or attacks coming through, new ones, but we also talk about zero trust, trust nothing. So, you know, the key to the castle, you get through the door bridge, but once you're through in the castle, you can go anywhere. No, you lock each door. So cybersecurity really has to be meshed into the business psyche and into the culture. And we don't even talk cybersecurity as a separate entity. It's called business overall. Less tools, more emphasis on process and people, because, you know, you've got a plethora of different toolkits out there overall. And it's not about a best of breed, it's about integration. And you go back to your traditional premise around security, is a layered approach overall. And it's understanding that layers that you want to put in, the controls, and, you know, it has to be proportionate to the threat. So the emphasis has to also very much around understanding your threat, the actors that will be arraigned against you, and their capability, and what do you need to defend. Because ultimately it's a trade-off of cost, you know, finite wants, infinite resources. Whereas for the financial sector, it's part of the critical national infrastructure. So therefore, it's very dependent on, for example, the global information infrastructure. There has to be a tie-up between those two as well. Online banking, so you're shrinking your physical footprint and you're putting people online deliberately overall. The existential threat that poses has changed quite considerably. You know, it gets back to the software development, and I emphasize that, because how we produce software is changing. You know, a lot of our listeners may be familiar with Docker. That was originally built for open source, but not production. You know, the development tool, not a product tool in terms of fit for production, but we're using it in production. Containerization means that you can't actually do full scans against this. This is very much like a lightweight Linux system overall. So what does that really mean? in terms of level of security expectation around that overall. The approach to cybersecurity has been slow and is very conservative. It's very still tools focused, software focused. What we need to really look at it is from a data centric position and work backwards from that. And what is proportionate, what is appropriate for this? Where do I focus my limited resources? What am I trying to protect? What is the risk that I can live with overall? And be candid and straight up with that.
And what you're talking about there, Alphus, is kind of a dynamic nature of, in this instance, we're talking about financial services, but there's a lot of other industries, I'm sure, that would kind of relate to this kind of intersection of technology versus traditional methods. And so I think it's an interesting point. And right now, more generally, we're in uncharted waters. I mean, in the light of the current COVID-19 situation, things are really fast moving. Last week on the show, for example, we talked about what that means for the remote workforce. A lot more people are working remotely or enforced kind of working remotely. And people are having to kind of shift their work patterns, shift their expectations. On that principle, and given what you're talking about on the kind of dynamic nature of some of the software aspects of the financial services sector, is some of the things in terms of quantifying risks and knowing what to do next about adapting to shifts in the market rather than finding a new way to continue as they have done before? I mean, how would you go about that?
Very much, you know, people are talking business continuity planning. You know, we prefer to think in terms of business adaptation planning, you know, jumping on agile. What is key now? And there's an old saying, you know, you don't fight a war based on the army you wish that you had, you fight a war based on the army that you have. So it gets back to saying, what do I have at this moment in time? We're operating remotely, be it VPN or Citrix. What are the known vulnerabilities and how do I try and buy that down in terms of some of the basic security hygiene that is necessary? You know, from patching is still one of our biggest issues right across the scope of the financial services. I'm sure we're not the only industry. We try to use, for example, Evergreen, so it's automatic from Microsoft. It doesn't always work on that one. Then, you know, your machines that are offline for a while, how do you keep them patched overall? The other key thing that we need to adapt in this environment is just the sheer terabytes of information that's coming through and data. What I talk about that is in, you know, from your SIEM, from your endpoints, from your edge, data after data coming through. There's very little intelligence that is coming through. We talk in terms of cyber threat intelligence. And if I was to focus and say, where does this security industry need to move? It needs to know how to filter data and information into actionable turnaround intelligence that means something. If I get something on the desk, it has to end in a verb. Do this, do that. And we don't. What we get is a trawl of information, alerts coming through. And then it's the interpretation for that. We need much greater depth of data mining, interpretation of that into action overall.
So this is a fascinating conversation that we've got going on here, Alphus, because what you're describing here is a fairly traditional industry in many respects, but one that is subject to rapid change because of the kind of the onset of digital initiatives, digital transformation, the way that people want to interact with you know, different apps or different ways of being able to spend money or be able to manage their finances. So there's a lot of dynamics on there, and we can talk about this you know, all day long really. But what I'd like to do is let's turn this over to the audience. Kerry, what's coming in on this? Because I know this is a subject that's kind of really resonated with a lot of people that are tuning in.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a few questions here actually, and I think we've covered off a couple as we've gone through. So thank you, Daryl and Sam. Let me know if you don't think they're covered, but I think they are. So what top tip would you give to a CISO who's going into a job in the financial services sector? And that is from Neil.
Expect the unexpected. Don't be frustrated because, you know, I entered in the financial sector. I came, I said, major events, including Formula One, and then into the fintech world, and then I jumped into a bank. What I was not ready for was the degree of politics, in terms of stovepiping, the degree of legacy, and the regulator as well. You've got to talk to the regulator, and you've got to be business focused. My top tip would be focus on what the business needs are. Step out of the IT world, because you're not part of IT as a CISO traditionally. Set yourself up that IT is part of the components that you use, but what you are is a business enabler, and you're reducing risk down to as low as practicable. Learn to communicate about cyber risk. That's my top tip. And also, you know, have a good whiskey cabinet. Long days, long nights, and it never ends. So whatever your poison is, your tipple is, stock up on it from now. And you'll be drafted into all aspects. Because the truth is now, cyber and IT and information enablement of the business touches root and branch. It is the lifeblood, the raison d'etre of the company. So be prepared to be involved in every discussion and be selective with your time in terms of what you're drafted into.
Brilliant, that's really good advice. And then finally, we've just got one from Ashley that sort of says, specifically thinking of this increased move to remote working, is there anything that banks or financial services need to put in place to make sure that their employees' data is protected?
Household, I would say from a practical point of view, make sure everyone is, whatever software that you use in terms of endpoint protection for your laptops, make sure it's up to date. A lot of things are just not up to date and patched overall. Have a secure VPN they can go across. It may sound obvious, but a lot of people don't. Citrix, as we know, is a bit leaky and has a number of vulnerabilities. The other key thing is to be able to remotely communicate with the individual and talk them through in terms of problems that they may have on their machine from the financial sector. The other key thing is you've got to understand what type of work that you're doing. Say if you're a trader and they've got trading rooms, JP Morgan, sub-trading rooms in people's houses, there's a lot that you're not supposed to do in terms of trading. When you go on the trading floor, you check your phone in, for example. You can't use your phone. Now, you've got to have to ensure that the processes of governance and compliance is still met. There's some flexibility around it. How do you enforce it? So one of the key things is to remind people that they're still under the same auspices and regulations there would be in a physical bank overall. The other thing is go back, revamp, and re-emphasize your IT security awareness, your cyber security awareness on phishing, attachments opening. These may sound like basic hygiene, but these are key. These are rudimentaries. Get them right first go at this time. Clearly lay out and articulate what your emphasis is going to be on. Like, for example, I'm trying to get people to emphasize over their email. It's critical in terms of how you protect that, because you're getting a torrent of attacks coming through. Some may use Proofpoint or Forcepoint. How do you blacklist domain names? This is cool. So you're trying to protect your user as much as possible. If we jump on the conferencing side, you know, there's much publicity around Zoom. The fact of the matter is all software is leaky. All software has vulnerabilities. It's your risk appetite and what you use it for. What is appropriate? That's appropriate for use if it's not sensitive or secret. So you can't just say don't use Zoom because we heard that publicity around, negative publicity around it. But from getting back to the question, apologies if I preambled a little bit, my focus would be on the culture, security culture, and awareness. The other one would be on your email. The other one is on how you remotely connect your VPN or your Citrix that comes through on this one, and monitoring and its speed of response if you do see something adversarial on your systems. And then also get people to recognize you're still in an office environment. This is still not your equipment there. So, you know, if you get up and you move away, you know what, close your laptop down, put in your passwords, some of the basic constituents, because it's slightly harder to help people in support lines outside of that. So they have to be slightly more self-sufficient. In the background, you're going to be pedaling like mad. Analyze, 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 and monitor what's coming through. Because through that, you pick up to become proactive in your defense. Work with what you got.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Alphus. A lot of top tips in that you've given us. there. Also notice that we're almost out of time on this one. We've certainly gone over our usual, but I think it's been a really interesting conversation. Anything else from the audience there, Kerry, before we wrap up?
No, I think the rest of it was covered. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Alphus. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been a really interesting conversation, and it's good to actually start to get beneath, you know, some of the challenges that are all too common, not just for financial services, but across the board as well. So you've helped really get beneath that for us. So I really appreciate that. We're almost at the end of today's webcast, but beforehand, let's go back to Kerry for a very quick 20-second wash up of today's news. What's going on there, Kerry?
Brilliant, thank you. Well, before I do, I want to give a shout out to Cham. Thank you very much for your astute observation last week that Steve Forbes looks like Nicolas Cage. Don't worry, we are not letting him hear the end of that, so keep them coming through. So in the news, this story actually makes me really sad. Info Security magazine reports that a threat group are using gift cards and teddy bears in a new physical phishing campaign. Victims received the email along with malicious USB and a letter claiming to be from the Customer Relations Department at Best Buy. The letter encourages victims to plug the USB into their computer, which then infects the device. Computer Weekly reports that Interpol has warned of more ransomware attacks on the healthcare sector. And finally, ZDNet, there's an attack aimed at Chinese government agencies and employees that is using zero-day vulnerability.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that quick roundup of the news. You know, one thing's for sure, every day is different in terms of new attack vectors, but sometimes they're also pretty similar as well. So it just goes back to that kind of the basics that you talked about earlier, Alphus, as well, of kind of keeping aware of those. So thanks for the wrap up of the news there, Kerry. And also thank you very much to our special guest today as well, Alphus Hinds. Also, special thanks to everyone front of house, so Kerry, Steve, here at 0 Days Live, everyone that's helping us behind the scenes as well, and of course to you, the audience, for joining us. Just a quick reminder before we go, it's Tech Tuesday tomorrow, so we'll be joined by Nominet's Eleanor Bradley, who's going to be talking to us about some of the work that Nominet's doing on the registry side, so please do join us then. Until then, have a good morning or a good afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.